Now we'll just try to understand that exposure triangle. You must have heard exposure triangle. So when we say exposure triangle, it's always about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So we are trying to create a good combination of all these components, three components, to make a good exposure. So in the definition, the exposure triangle comprises aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These three components and lens controls work together to regulate the amount of light that makes it to the camera sensor. So these two components, if you see, they are just regulating the light, that how much light reach the sensor, aperture and shutter speed, they control that. But the sensitivity, the how the camera sensing the light, the sensitivity of the camera sensor controlled by the ISO. We can raise the sensitivity. If you raise the ISO, camera is capable of sensing more light. Even in the low light condition, if you raise the ISO, you can see that image coming a little brighter, but they'll show some grainy effect like a noise in the image. So this is we can say that the rule how we should we can say that make a good combination of shutter speed and ISO. So like this, if you want exposure to be same always, so whatever the steps you are following, you have to compensate with the other. Mostly we are playing with the shutter speed and aperture to create a balance between the aperture and the shutter speed to get good exposure. But if light is low, then we may need to depend on the ISO. So we need to take a help from the ISO to get better exposure. Now we'll just understand the shutter speed in little detail. Shutter speed is the length of time that the camera shutter remain open and allow the light to reach the camera sensor. So as I said, it's for regulating the light, how much light reach the sensor. It can control that. If we increase the shutter speed as very high, it'll allow lesser light. If we are on the long exposure, it'll allow more light to reach the sensor. So these are the example. We can say models or a set of shutter speeds. Just for reference, you can utilize this. Like for 1/4, 1/4000 to 1/1000. So these are very high shutter speeds to freeze fast moving objects. So even nowadays cameras, we have their support shutter speed of 1/8000 also. 1/250 to 1/60. These are shutter speed we use for journal photos where objects are still or showing very slow movement. So these slow movements or still objects you can capture at this shutter speed. 1/2 to 1/30. These consider to be little kind of long exposure. It'll create some kind of motion blur. If something is moving and you try to capture, it'll create a blur effect on a consistent movement, like a waterfall. If you want to capture a waterfall at the shutter speed, like for 1/10 shutter speed, if you're going to capture a waterfall, it'll give you a kind of flow, milky motion effect on the water. And 2 to 10 seconds, when you see single digits, these are seconds. So 2 to 10 seconds, consider very long exposure. You can use these long exposure to capture star fireworks. So, and even you can create light painting. So if you can paint object in a dark room, you can use this long shutter speed and you can use a torch. You can create some artistic creative effect on an object. You can paint the subject with your own torch and you'll see the result. We can make a river water like a glass. So if you are around the river and it's quite dark condition in the evening, if you don't have ND filter, of course, so if you don't have ND filter to stop the light, these are the filters available in the market where you can use in the daylight condition, these filters to stop we can say the reference, like 1 stop, 2 stop, 10 stops. So there are different stops ND filter available. So that's how many stops it'll block the light. So you can use those filters, or you can wait for the dark condition where in the it's sunset completed, so everything is dark. You can use the long shutter speed and you can see the effect of a long exposure on the river water. These are just reference images. For fast shutter speed, you can see that that person it just looks static. It just freezes the moment. And slow shutter speed, it's just making that motion blur. So whatever element or the subject is moving, it'll create a blur motion effect with the slow shutter speed. These are just reference values for shutter speed. We can have as low as 30 seconds and as high as 1 by 4,000. There are some devices which can support 1 by 8,000 shutter speed as well. So whenever we are changing shutter speed from one to other, it can be increment, it can be decrement, so decreasing the value. So we'll call this as one step. So whatever the value we are changing one step. So this one step you are changing here, it means it's we can say if you are increasing shutter speed, it is just making the light half. It is cutting the light half, which is reaching the sensor. If you slow the shutter speed by one step, it will double the amount of light which is reaching the sensor. That's how we calculate the light. And there is a thumb rule for handheld shutter speed. So whenever you are holding the camera on your hand, you don't have tripod, so just check that focal length of your lens. So whatever the focal length you have, like the 50 mm, just for example I've shared here. So if you have 50 mm lens, you can have your shutter speed somewhere around 1 by 60 or higher, because there is no shutter speed of 1 by 50. So you can have a shutter speed of 1 by 60 or higher, and it will make sure that it will not be a shaky image, it will not be blurry image. These are the handheld techniques, how we can handle the DSLR camera, the knee band. So if you in all these techniques, what we are trying to achieve here, the stability. We will be having camera in more stable position, so it's less shaky. You can see that the knee bend technique, it's making the knee as a platform. We are holding the elbows, and that's how we can utilize this, use this technique. Elbow plant, it means we are planting our elbow on some hard surface. It can be anything which will be helpful to you plant the elbow and make it more stable. Instead of a knee, if you see, instead of a knee, we are using some hard surface to plant the elbow. The T-Rex, it's a quite orthodox traditional technique where we can just make your elbow near to the body, make your hand like a platform and hold the camera. That's how we can place it. And it'll give you more stability. The more stability you have in your handheld, the better quality of images you will see that in your results. The taut strap, it's a new technique where we can just wear the camera strap and just stretch it. And it'll just create a tension with the strap, and it'll make sure that it's less shaky and less wobbly, and you'll feel more control, and you may see the better results. You can try all these techniques and see how it works for you. Now we'll talk about aperture. So the definition is the aperture f-stop. When we talk about aperture, it's f-stop. You must have heard this term many times, f-stop. So f-stop means we are talking about aperture. It controls the amount of light reaching the sensor. Again, it's regulating the light, how much light reaching the sensor. Sometimes we call it as a lens eye. The aperture size will regulate the depth of field. So the smaller we can say, the smaller the f number, the larger the eye hole. We'll see some examples in the coming slides. F 1.4 create bokeh effect and good for low light. So when we are dealing with the low f number, it means we are working with shallow depth of field. If we can increase f number, it will increase the depth of field. So depth of field is something, if we are pointing on a subject here, some part in front, some part behind will be in focus. The rest of them will start blurring out, will start out of focus, and at some point they'll not be visible, kind of. So that create bokeh effect. If we have some bright elements in the background, they'll not be completely blur out, but they'll become a kind of circle. So that we call bokeh. F2.8 to F5.6, good for portrait and sports photography, because when we are shooting portrait, we want subject to be in good focus. So mostly when we are shooting the live subject, we take a focus from the eye. So something in front and something in behind will be in focus. That's how we make sure that our subject will be in good focus with F2.8 on a prime lens to F5.6. F8 to F16, good for landscape to get increased depth of field. So when we want to work with large depth of field, we have to have aperture F8 to F16. f16 to f32. So because the higher the f number you have, it's blocking more light. So it means if you want to work with the long exposure, you'll have f16 to f32. Without using ND filters, you can work with the long exposure. And it can create starburst effect. Starburst effect is something like it will create sparkles around the light, and mostly it will work with the wide angle lenses, or lens around 50 mm also can give you starburst effect with small focal length. Now we'll just try to little more dig down on the depth of field, try to understand what is depth of field. The distance in front of and behind the focus point that appears to be in the focus is referred to as depth of field, as we have tried to understand in the previous slide. Large f number means small aperture, small f number means large aperture. This is the term you should be very careful, because sometimes we get confused that with these terms, small aperture, large aperture. So small aperture means the lens eye is very small, and it only happens when the f number is very large. And large aperture means when lens eye is very wide open, and it only happens when we are working with small f number. So they are just reverse, or we can say that we can say that in a different proportion. So f number will be small and aperture will be large. So that's how it works. If you can see that large f number, we have everything is in focus. If we focus in the middle box, so you can see rest of the boxes behind and in front, all are in focus. And in this photo, if you can see, if we focus right in the middle box, some boxes in front, some boxes in the behind are out of focus. That's how it regulates depth of field. These are the reference, or we can say the values what we can have on the device. Based on the lens, what lens you are using, it can restrict to some f numbers. You need to take a reference of your lens. In the lens, you can see that f number, what the limitation it has. And just for reference, how we call these f numbers: f1.4 is very large aperture, f32 is very small aperture. In between, we have large aperture from f2.8 and small aperture f11. We have a medium aperture around f5.6 to f8. Again, if we are changing value from one to other, we'll call that one step. If we are increasing f number by one step, it's we can say that half down the amount of light reaching the sensor. And again, if we are lowering the f number, it's double the amount of light reaching the sensor. That's how it regulates the light. And again, if we are having small f number, it will create small depth of field and it will make the image lighter. If you have large f number, it will increase the depth of field, but at the cost of light, you will see the image coming little darker. So you have to depend heavily on the light conditions. You can use your artificial light, you can use your ambient light, depend on the daylight what you're working on. ISO sensitivity. So ISO sensitivity is a measure of the camera's ability to capture light. So we are talking about ISO, and we have already understood that if we increase ISO, it means it will create some grainy effect. Why it is? Because digital camera converts the light that falls on the image sensor into electrical signals for processing. ISO sensitivity is raised by amplifying the signal. In other words, if ISO sensitivity is raised from 100 to 200, while aperture left unchanged, the same exposure can be achieved with shutter speed as twice as fast. So it means we are allowing more light by increasing the ISO. So if you are seeing that you are in a low light condition where shutter speed is getting very low and you don't have any other option, then you have to raise the ISO. So if you can raise the ISO from 100 to 200, you can have double shutter speed. So whatever the shutter speed you are getting in that light condition, you will have double on the double shutter speed on that, and you can see that by raising ISO, you can reach that handheld shutter speed, but at the cost of again that grainy effect, the noise. The same the same exposure can be achieved with shutter speed as twice as fast. If you raise ISO sensitivity, you can choose faster shutter speed and reduce camera blur. Again, if you get a handheld shutter speed, it will reduce the camera shaky effect, the blur effect on the image. This is why people say the ISO sensitivity should be raised if lighting is poor. So only depend on the ISO when light condition is not good. Otherwise, try to keep it minimal. And just for reference, in shadow days, in the cloudy days, when there is no sunlight, you can have ISO somewhere around ISO 200 to 400. In shadow area where where subject is coming little darker under the shadow, you can have ISO around 800. So these are the kind reference values we can use. No flash, low light photography. When lighting is poor, you can use a flash to light portrait subject. Flash units, however, have limited range. So all the flash units, or whatever the strobe lights you're using, they have limited range. So you have to make sure that your subject is within that range to get a better exposure. If you raise ISO sensitivity, you can optimally expose both the portrait and the subject and the background without using flash at all. If you see the reference images below, photo taken with the flash, subject is in good light, but the ambient light in the background is not captured because flash having limited range. But if you see the photo on the right, photo taken with high ISO sensitivity without flash, you can see the subject is also in the good light, and you can see the ambient light in the background. So that's the benefit of using ISO. But again, we have to depend on the light condition. Noise at high ISO, raising ISO sensitivity, it means we are allowing faster shutter speed, but it'll increase the grainy effect. It'll give you a lot of benefit with the handheld shutter speed, but again at the cost of a grainy effect, the noise effect you will see. So what is this noise effect? So ISO sensitivity can introduce a type of image artifact known as noise. This is a technical term into noise into your photographs, making them seem grainy. So they'll look quite grainy. And raising ISO sensitivity amplifies the electric signals, which also amplifies any noise in the signal. So whatever the signals it's a camera getting, it amplifies that. It's the raising end. That's why that grainy effect coming. As a result, the higher ISO sensitivity, the more obvious effects of your noise on your photographs. The same is true for all digital cameras. We recommend that you raise ISO sensitivity only as high as needed to avoid blur. So again, I'm repeating this so many times, that only raise ISO when till the point when you need shutter speed which is required to complete your exposure. Just till that point to raise the ISO, just to achieve that. If you see the reference image here, ISO 12,800 showing a lot of grainy effect. ISO 100, it's quite clean. ISO sensitivity can be set manually by the photographer or automatically by the camera. So you can have auto ISO enabled on your device if it supports auto ISO. In Nikon, we have option to set minimum, we can say the shutter speed at auto ISO, how low it can go on the shutter speed, and we can also set what would be the maximum ISO sensitivity it can reach. So you can set that maximum ISO sensitivity limit even in the auto ISO. It will not use very high values. It will only use values which you set in the camera settings. That's how you can control it. But in Canon, we don't have that option. It will be auto. It means complete auto. You don't have any other control. And in auto ISO, it can take any ISO value depend on the light condition. Camera simulator app. Now we'll just try to understand these exposure triangles components in the simulator. So you can see this in the shooting mode. We are in the shutter priority. So as I said, in the shutter priority, we can only play with the shutter speed. So when you are changing shutter speed, to compensate or to create a good balance, because in the semi modes, it's always give you optimal exposure, but it'll try to adjust the aperture. If you raise shutter speed, it lower the aperture, because what we are doing by raising shutter speed, we are halving the amount of light reaching the sensor, and by lowering the f number, it's just compensating that value, and it's allowing same balance exposure at the lower f number. That's how it's work. And if you are on, let me check this. If you're on 1/30 shutter speed, and if you raise ISO, you can see it's allowing you to use that aperture at higher number. That's the benefit of it. But if we are in aperture priority, we can manage shutter speed, so we don't have any control. We have control on aperture. So like just for example, if you are on f5 5.6, and if you raise ISO, it will allow higher shutter speed. So you just can see how it changes. On ISO 100, shutter speed is 1/250. On ISO 200, shutter speed is 1/500. So that's how it helps. Just for example, again, if you are on 1/30 shutter speed and you are using 50 mm lens on f22, then on ISO 200, it's giving you 1/30. You can raise ISO to 400 to reach 1/60. That's how you can create your good combination for shutter speed and aperture, even in the aperture priority. In manual mode, we can change all these components and we can create our own combination. So all these combinations we can create, we can manage all these components to create our own artistic style of work. But always take a reference of these semi modes. Before going to the manual mode, just do a lot of practice with the semi modes, and you will feel more comfortable with the manual, because you will get idea of what will be the good combination of camera settings.